So we're adding component 1, right? Okay, that's kind of cool, right? We're dynamically adding component 1. And the cool thing about this is that once it's loaded, that it's not going to do the refresh again. We're adding component 1 every time we click this button. But you know, it's only the very first time that it's going to go out and it's going to grab our script that has, you know, our compiled Angular component in it. So to show that, let's just add another button that adds component 2. Well, no, let's go a little bit. We'll go a little bit crazy, right? So here we're going to do an input, and this input will be, well, we'll give it a name. This input will be component name, and we will do an ng model on this. And here we'll bind this to the component name. And we need to import our ng model because the forms module, because we are in a standalone component. So there's our forms module. So now we've added our component name. We need to add the class to bind to. So protected component name, and we'll start with 1. Right, we're going to give a short name to do these. So now we're bound to the name, and now instead of saying add component 1, what we're going to do is we're just going to call add component. And here we'll make this one protected too, because we don't want people to call it from outside. And here what we'll say is if not this dot component name, then we're going to alert you need a component to load, or you need to specify a component to load, right? And right now our user experience isn't very good. One thing that we can probably do to help this out is inside of here, we could add our placeholder, and it will be enter 1, 2, or 3. Just to give somebody an idea if they clear everything out. And then here, we're going to just do a case statement. And what we'll do is case, we'll do a switch. It's a switch statement, right? We'll switch on this dot component name. And inside of here, we'll do case. So we'll get back to where we are right now, right? So case 1, we are going to call, and instead of this, now we're going to say component promise, and component promise is going to be of type dynamic components, and it needs to be a promise. And I didn't specify where we're using from, right? The reason we're using from is because when we use this import statement, it uses promises, right? Which you could see. I'll have to clean this up. So here, and then we'll add the default case, which is going to be alert. And I don't know what this component name is. And we can say enter 1, 2, or 3. And we aren't going to return this. Instead, we are going to call, do a break here because we don't want to fall through. But we're going to call, we're going to say, we're going to make this private. And we're going to say add component to form, or we'll say add component to page, right? And here we can just say this is component promise. So that fixes that. Now if we've got 1, now we need to just do this dot add component to page. And we'll just move this stuff up inside of it. We'll take off our semicolon. And I rely pretty heavily on Prettier. I will admit that. Right now it's pretty simple. What we've done is we've changed it. So now add component expects something to be in the box. We're going to default with the box being set to 1. So a valid component will load. We've got a couple of things to handle it. One thing we could do is just make sure that we are the locale lowercase, right? To make sure that we're properly lowercasing things and handling things properly. So at this point, actually, let me check chat. I've been going on a little bit. So Rain All Day says, I didn't know there was a separate NGRX component package. It's one of my favorite packages, actually. I use it all the time. Yes, I want my subject to emit an instance of a component, and we could actually change this back, right? So rather than swapping our observable every time, we could go back to our component equals new subject, and we'll just grab this right here. And we don't even need the or null anymore. So there we go. So we've got that. You know, one thing I could do, if we go back to our dynamic host component, if I wanted to use the NGRX push pipe again, we could do this, or if it's undefined, then we could do null, and that's going to work. So there, now our component, we can change this back to being component, and we can make it read only again, equals component. And here we can do this dot component dot as observable. So there's that. So now what we can do is we can do it won't work. It would require a little bit more. So there's our NGRX push or our null. And here, this will again, our subject of type that or null. So there's that. So now we can change it. We're swapping it on the fly. So we're passing the promise up. Everything's there. So now if we look, we compiled successfully. If we go look again, we haven't loaded anything. As soon as I hit add component 1, it dynamically loads component 1, right? Right now, if I enter 2, it's going to tell me, I don't know what 2 is, enter 1, 2, or 3, right? If I empty it out, we need to specify a component to load. So let's get 2 and 3 working also. So with our case, we can just do case 2. And yep, here we'll just do our import. And we're going to do / component 2 / component 2. And at this point, we are going to do a next or then. And again, we're going to do component and component dot. And here we'll grab the component 2 component and we'll close that. So there we go. So now we've imported 2 and now we need to break. And there we go. So now we're in a better state because now we can load component 1, but we can also load component 2. And notice that it's loading the appropriate the appropriate stubs based on what we're doing. But if we go back to component 1, it swapped it, but notice we don't load it again, right? So in component 2, right? But we can now swap back and forth between our components. And this is based entirely on user input, right? So we can do case 3, break. And case 3 is just going to be import .. / component 3. And then we can do component 3.ts. And then we do our .then. And inside of here, we do component and component component 3 component. And that's it. And this is a common theme that you'll see as we do more and more dynamic stuff, right? If we want to lazy load something, this is the key. Webpack understands that once we do this, it needs to build some new chunks. And we can see that here. This is what I was trying to show before, but notice that it built this apps dynamic components source app components component 3 component, right? So it's made this giant chunk, but our chunks are tiny, right? So our main chunk is 14K, right? Our application isn't that big, and our components are super tiny themselves. They aren't doing a whole lot. But we're saving ourselves 6K. So this could be 20K if we weren't, if we were using like a switch statement or something like that. Then our chunks would be bigger. But because we aren't referring to our chunks anywhere outside of this import statement, then Webpack knows that, hey, I create a new chunk with this. And based on that chunk, that we can do stuff with it. And so using this strategy of dynamically loading components we can we can dramatically cut down on the amount of content that we're initially serving to our users, which in turn allows our users to do, our application to load faster, our users to have a better time, especially if they're on like a phone, right? Because one of the things about this dynamic workflow that I'm building at work is there's a whole bunch of controls that could show up on the page. But a user may only see 10 to 15% of those controls as they're using it. So why do we want to send the other 85% to the browser? We don't. So instead, what we can do is by doing something like this, we are in effect making it so that they only get the stuff when they need it, right? And it's milliseconds to get these back. It's interesting, the difference here and here. This must be cached somewhere. But once it's there, and this is entirely driven by the user. Super simple. And this is the simplest form that I've found of doing dynamic component loading like this. And again, what I really want to stress, right, is that we aren't wiring a button to anything in particular. And these case statements can exist in a service, right? So we could have a service where we could pass it the import and then, a function that pulls whatever comes out of the import, right? So we could pass this back from a service. So we could have a service where we can feed it, JSON. The service can parse the JSON, determine what we want to do, and then return the data back based on that JSON. In the simplest way. One thing I haven't tried to do, well, okay, a couple of things to point out about this one as it is, but we'll stage all of this and just say that we simplest form of dynamic components works, right? So let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. So at this point, we've seen, yes, Reynalde. Let me get to the chat because I think the chat is an important thing to look at right now. Reynalde says, yes, I'm trying to get my subject to emit an instance of a component. There are ways to do that we'll see in the future. Because, well, like I said, this is the simplest way to do it. This is actually the way that I used to do when I talked about that left side nav. That left side nav or menu is using this exact strategy. It is using the ng component outlet, and it is swapping the observable. And by doing that, people can navigate through the menu, and the menu has, so each item in the menu has a property on it that comes from the server that says, this is the component I want. The component's built, but it's not loaded in the browser until the user clicks on that. One of the big reasons why we did that was because one of the big things about the workflow is that each step in the workflow can be completed by a different person. And so if I go into the workflow and I complete, I complete the first step, finish it, as soon as that's finished, the server's going to go do its thing, and it's going to say, okay, the next step is ready. It's going to send a notification through the application to the person who does that next step. So the common use case is for me to go to my notifications, click on the notification, only see the first step, so I only need to load that first step. I save it. That takes me back to the main part of the application, or who knows where I want to go from there. But I go back to wherever I want to go. I navigate away from there, but I've only ever loaded that one component, right? And then the next person comes along and they need the second step. And boom, they get the second step. That's all that's loaded for them. But say they want to look at what I did, they can click on my step because it's completed, and they'll get a read-only view of the step that I completed. So they can see what I did. And then they can go back to their step, complete their step, and then, the third person will get that. And that's how it works. So in like 90% of the cases, most people are only ever going to look at their step. It doesn't make any sense to load all the rest of it, right? So the next question is, so a component method doesn't have to be public in order to be called by the template. Has that always been the case? No. Rain all day long. That has not always been the case. It was introduced in Angular 14. I don't know if it was 14.1 or 14.2 or Angular 14, but one of those made it so that we can make things protected now. And by making them protected, then they're only available to their own template and, internally to the class. But, we aren't exposing a public API. And then Rain All Day says, so lazy loading is why you're doing import statements. Yes, exactly. And that's why I'm not using entry components and things like that. The other thing is that if I'd set this up as a pure standalone application, entry components doesn't even make sense. You use a different loader and you tell it the first component to load. Standalone came in Angular 14, and I think it's being moved to general use in Angular 15. Very, very robust. I find it a lot easier. I find having all of my imports right here and having this entire component be contained, self-contained, is a big deal. It's a nice thing to do. Some caveats about this method. The first really big caveat we have is that this method only allows one component to be injected. So the component outlet, when it gets a new component, it is going to clear itself and then add the new component, which I would, after having done this for a long time, I would say in 60 to 70% of the cases, that's all you want. Just be aware of that by using this, I can't feed it like an array of components. Well, I don't know if I could. I don't think I can. Component outlet. I don't think it would. And this should no longer say add component one. So we've got that. There we go. So we're in the simplest case though, right? When we add this component, right now all it's saying is component one works, right? All we're presenting is static HTML. Using this method, the other thing, we don't really have a way of sending inputs to the component, right? There's no real way with the component outlet we can send content, we can send modules or factories or stuff like that, but like binding to inputs requires extra work going this way. So this is the most simple way to do it. If you want to use this way and send data to your components, how would we do that, right?